Okay, welcome to another one of these more conversational episodes of The Periphery. We're going to be trying to bring this to you regularly. It'll all stay in the same feed, but there's a chance I may start differentiating these episodes with Bailey where we're talking and it's a little more, I guess, like a little more podcasty in the sense of like two people from Pulaski sitting and talking about weekly news stories and trying to put our sort of organizational missional spin on them, as opposed to the stuff that's still going to be happening where I bring in people. Next week, Alex Middlewood, who wrote one of our 50 takes pieces on Kansas and who has been on the pod before, is going to come back, and that's going to be fun. We're going to talk a little bit more about politics in Kansas and in the Midwest and Plains. So that'll be great. And I'm looking forward to that. But for now, we're going to kick off another week of law news, which is unavoidable at this point in the U.S. news cycle. Uh, Bailey, we have the Supreme Court deciding to hear this Trump immunity argument. We also have what looks like more delay down in South Florida with Judge Aileen Cannon. And it also looks like we are moving quickly towards a resolution in the Fonnie Willis situation in Georgia. All big election relevant news, some of which touches on kind of our concern about local or regional rule of law, but all of which matter for the November election. So, why don't you kick us off with this Supreme Court move? I mean, look, there have been, I think we've seen everything from catastrophizing in terms of the court is ready to tear down democracy, which I don't fully buy that end of it, but we've seen everything from that to this is no big deal at all, which I also don't think is applicable. Um, so give us a rundown on where you think this puts us. We're not even a full 9 months out now, but the adage up until now had been, we have enough time to make a baby between now and the election. We no longer do. So we're inside 9 months. Uh, Break it down.
Well, I mean, I think this is definitely, kind of points of conversation. I don't think this was unexpected after, right, the circuit court kicked it over, particularly giving Trump the time to appeal, right? They were all clearly very united and unified in this argument about presidential immunity, saying that there is no chance. Very much from the outset of, the day that you left office is the day that you became Citizen Trump. In these circumstances. And so I don't think it's that surprising, but I do think that it's a reflection of, right, how this process of law works. Right. And of course, working through the system, which is something that people oftentimes don't understand, right? They think that the judicial resolution is just the judicial resolution, it's going to be done. Right. But until it reaches the Supreme Court, until it gets to that point, right, there's not going to be an answer, right, or a definitive answer. So I think it's an interesting point. I do think that as far as delay goes, it really does put us in a much tighter window because the court has announced that they're going to hear this case or the week of April 22nd. A great birthday present, let me tell you. When I was thinking about that the other day. Right. But they said they were going to hear this case that week. That means that the decision is likely going to come right in the final dregs of the term, which means June. We've seen the court stretching it even further into July, right, with some cases, or close to July with some cases. Then you're talking about general trial process. We're not going to really see anything getting seated, a jury in these cases getting seated until, at earliest, early September, right, more likely October. And then, right, again, like you said, we are right at the cusp of the election. Am I surprised that they decided to take the immunity case? Not really. I mean, we have a history and these kind of constitutional questions dealing with immunity. The court has been very clearly firm, right, on immunity as far as civil cases go. We can look back of all of these different instances, right, Nixon, Clinton, so on and so forth, right, with Supreme Court case law. This is just a different perspective, right? This is a different situation that we're dealing with because we are pressing up against an election, right? The Supreme Court is not known for being a fast-moving institution. And so, right, even to grant to hear this case. There's not that, but we do have, much bigger circumstances that we're dealing with. And honestly, even with the Supreme Court giving, the affirmative nod to hearing this case, I don't think that many individuals are going to be very accepting of the answer that they do give. Right,
Right, there are people who
especially in.
just at this point, I mean, Trump's most diehard supporters fully buy this immunity argument, which I mean, I don't really think we need to be too worried that the Supreme Court is going to say that presidents have blanket immunity.
No, I
I
don't
think the
think
bigger
we do.
question is why, if they were going to take this, why did they wait? And why did they time it in such a way that we're almost inevitably not going to get resolution on anything before the election happens?
I think that's just a tactic. I think the court does that with everything. I don't think we realize it in the same way, right, that we often do because we don't think about the semantics of it. Right, very very rarely does the court hear cases that have such a pressing tie to them. And so again, they're not a fast moving institution. We've seen a couple of cases in the past where they've heard cases out of a necessity, right? Of course, dealing with right confidential documents and dealing with censorship, right, and prior restraint. Of course, we've dealt with that, but the court has never had to move on anybody else's timeline. It's their timeline. And they kind of reflected that here now by saying it. Even more so, right? I think that the composition of the court doesn't really surprise me to leading into this factor is again, they are just bare bones putting it out there that, yeah, we know we need to hear this case. But we're going to hear it when we want to, right? A 6-3 conservative decision, 3 of those appointees put forward by Trump. Now, that's not to say that the court has been all that favorable to Trump in all of his decisions or in their decisions, especially with other cases. Right, they have been good, at least in the sense of right hearing cases, and they currently have 2 cases right pending with him, this immunity case, and then of course right the earlier cases. So or sorry, the disqualification case. My brain just stopped working there for a second, to be very honest. I was like, there's an important case that's happening. Oh, yes, it's the disqualification case. So sorry about that. But they're dealing with both of those cases right now, moving at the glacial pace that the court moves at. And I'm not surprised about it at all, to be very frank.
So I think if we're talking about this case, I want to move maybe to the case where I think delay is perhaps the most glaring issue,
Mm-hmm.
and that is absolutely these Mar-a-Lago documents case down in South Florida.
Mm-hmm.
The Supreme Court choosing to take this immunity argument and doing it as it does. There's so many institution. You could absolutely get involved in the debates about whether or not it's appropriate that the court is trying to, I think, punt a little bit on this.
Mm-hmm.
But I do think it's appropriate to, I don't personally take it as being in necessarily bad faith that the court doesn't like to get involved in
Oh,
what feel like main stage, center spotlight, election time decisions. On the other hand, I think working in the other direction is what's going on in South Florida, where there's really not a good reason. And Jack Smith has been trying to make this clear for a little bit now.
oh,
But this
absolutely.
case isn't moving forward, other than what feels like the at least unspoken in the in in the maybe in the mainstream press, but very clear to most commentators elsewhere, which is it's the case that looks like it's the most obvious slam dunk against Donald Trump, and Aileen Cannon is a Trump appointee. And let's be clear about this: not every judge who is appointed by a president is in the back pocket of that. That's not how that works. It's certainly not how it should work. But Eileen Cannon has a very clear track record of being rabidly pro-Trump, and so I do think this is a moment where we have to be a little worried. And this actually dovetails a little
Mm-hmm.
news-wise with the other news of the week, which is McConnell's retirement. And one of
Mm-hmm.
his legacies will have been, because he was so effective at tying up Obama appointees, that
Mm-hmm.
Donald Trump was able to push a whole lot of people through.
Right.
And not every Trump appointee is or was a hack, but some of
Mm-hmm.
them. And we are seeing right now what it looks like for some of the judiciary to have been filled with, frankly, I think you can make the argument that Cannon was underqualified. I think you can absolutely make the argument that she is I mean, I think the best faith argument is that this is just her first time handling a case like this, and that's about the best thing that can be said. The worst case, I think, argument is that that there might actually be some pro-Trump bias to how she's managing this case.
Oh, yes. And to say underqualified is a lot nicer statement. In fact, many of the Trump appointees, right, during this process, this is actually one of my favorite things to talk about with students in classrooms is talking about qualifications in general, right? And the APA and the ABA's right role in all of that. And of course, how that is diminished and how that's grown and changed with president from president to president. But right, Trump had more unqualified candidates or not qualified, right, according to the ABA than any other presidential individual, right, making these appointments as president. To the point that, right, many of his candidates actually pulled out. Right, there were instances of right emotional outbursts in their hearings. Right, instances of like absolute lack of knowledge to the point of literal ignorance, even to basic process. So I think that's a huge part of it.
I think this is also like the next like kind of crash course, particularly maybe for if you're a more liberal oriented person. The argument has been for a decade or so that liberals didn't take the Supreme Court seriously enough. Well, I think the next argument is that, well, they don't take the district court seriously enough, right? Because there has been a laser focus since 2016, and particularly I think since the Kavanaugh hearings, for
Mhm,
people of more moderate to center left persuasion to start carrying out the courts in the way conservatives really have since Bork.
mhm,
What there hasn't been, I think, is a realization that a lot of the change and a lot of the stuff that's going to happen legally in terms of affecting people's lives is going to happen at the district courts. I mean, the Supreme Court is the marquee; it's the top court, it's our nation's highest court. But these
mhm,
district courts matter a lot for law and the rule of law in this country.
mhm.
And I just
No,
wanted to hop in with that.
no. I think that's extremely important. And I mean, God, just come teach my class to tell my students all this, which I know you can, totally do. But it's not, it's not just the district courts; it's the circuit courts as well, right? And again, my own research is in the state supreme courts, and people don't realize that the vast majority of cases that are handled, right, are handled in these courts. And the vast amount of the decisions that are made in law, right, across the country, right, don't reach the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court hears less than 1% of the cases that are appealed to it every single year. Right, going through that whole process, whereas the circuit courts have to hear every single case, right? The district courts, of course, depending on jurisdiction, have to hear every single case, right? And then, of course, all of that pending, the pending jurisdictional issues, the rights of appeal, all of those things. And so people don't understand that. People also don't understand that these judges serve for life. Um, right? They think that that's just a Supreme Court thing. It's not, right? They think that just federal judges are just the Supreme Court, and they're not,
No,
right?
and they put
So
through young judges. During the
and they
time
do.
they put
It
young
was it
judges
was a concerted effort. It was not only right the changes that we saw in the state legislatures, right, with the Republican and the GOP and the Republican Party, right, focusing on changing and converting state legislatures. It was also happening in the judiciary. It was also happening in the state judiciaries as well as right the federal bench. The number of appointees that were open ended, right? We also saw because of judicial nominees, right? This is why the filibuster, right? The nuclear option, right? This is why this got blown up right, between all of these things. And McConnell was extremely successful, right? Of course, we only hear about the case with Merrick Garland, right, and getting to fill the seat, but there were so many other judges before that. Um, and I mean, even again, like I said, that ABA qualification, right? They had been an integral part of the nominating process, right, for so many presidents, whether Republican or Democrat, for the longest time. And it wasn't really until we see right modern presidents kind of taking a questionable stance to this. Some of that is the emergence, right, of the Federalist Society, right, having a piece and part in that, and that being the referential part or the referential body that these individuals were looking to for qualifications or understanding of qualifications. So there's that as well. I mean,
I
this
want
is
to ask
not.
you about the Federalist Society a little bit because
Okay.
I do think that one of the most impressive things for the last few decades in conservative politics was really I mean, quite frankly, the skill with which their activists organized, and particularly the Federalist Society and other legal activists on the conservative side organized, not just to put forward ideas, but to put forward uh, talented, very talented, right? I
Mhm.
mean, judges and candidates. I mean, we highlighted the underqualification problem for Trump, but for a
Mhm.
long time it was, I mean, really some impeccably skilled individuals. Um, One of the things though that I think we've seen, right, is a fracturing of that movement under Trump between the people who are willing to go along with a more
Mhm.
MAGA-oriented party and the people who aren't.
Mhm.
So, is there any sense in which some of this, frankly, like well-oiled machine that was built,
Mhm.
particularly post-Borg, has
Mhm.
come apart in some ways, and that McConnell leaving is maybe even the sort of last bit of that? That with him gone, that there's really not actually that kind of like uh well-designed system and pipeline for putting people into the bench on the conservative side that there was, because of the ways that Trump has fractured the legal community, with prominent people like Judge Ludig and George Conway coming out against him, and then
Mhm.
finally also I think just with the kind of catastrophic loss of talent in the bench, right? McConnell going away, we don't know who's going to be the next Senate leader. It's almost certainly not going to be somebody who has the skills that McConnell had. Even if you
Yeah,
think he used him for nefarious ends, he had a lot of talent, and I don't think there's any chance
I,
that his successor will match him.
again, I mean, he built a political machine that was exactly that, right? It was a machine and it did its job. So I will wholly and wholesale agree with that, no matter what, that kind of side ended up onto. And again, it wasn't even just a political machine of putting these individuals into right and onto the bench, right, and moving them into the power of line. It was also right. I've been sitting here praising the ABA because of their use, right, in a nonpartisan essence, right. They also attacked that institution, right. They attacked the institution, and unfortunately, right, there's academic research out there that says they were absolutely right to, right. In fact, some of my own like I would say fellow scholars, but literally one of my members of my dissertation chair, like my dissertation, right, wrote an article talking about the bias of the ABA when it comes to qualifications, especially of these circuit court and district court judges. Right, they were much more likely to grant a qualified or well qualified ranking to liberal judges than they were to conservative nominees. Or I guess I should say liberal nominees and conservative nominees, right, to correct my language there. And so it was a host of all of these pieces and parts, right, that fed into that. I don't The talent is still there, right? There is still many of these judges and many of these potential judges that are still there, right, in the legal community. I don't think that's gone away. Um, the problem is just trying to identify them at this point. Again, I think part of that is the importance of what is happening on the state level. Many of these former individuals were working through processes. They were working through different entities in the legal community within their state, right? That's how they got highlighted, right? I say to my students all the time that, right, getting a position on the federal bench is a lot about luck. Right. The Federal Society and McConnell's machine and all of this kind of removed a lot of that, right? It put these steps into place that it literally just fed the machine. Um, I think, like you said, with Trump being as what's the word I'm looking for? Divisive as he is, and also kind of person on a lot of wit that relies a lot on whim. At least whatever today's is and whatever tomorrow's is. Yeah, he's removed some of that because if he finds somebody that he wants to put on the bench, he's going to find a way to put him on the bench. Um, Granted, I think there are still some institutional checks
Well,
to that.
what concerns me there is that I think the strength of that pipeline in some ways prevented perhaps some of Trump's worst instincts, because I think there were a lot of people, that
Mhm.
Donald Trump simply didn't really have any knowledge of. The idea that Donald Trump has a deep knowledge of
Oh no.
judicial appointees, or was sitting back going, I really like the way Neil Gorsuch handles Native American affairs, and that's why I'm going to put him on the court. He wasn't. So in some
No,
ways,
that hasn't
the
gone away.
more this, if he were to be reelected, the more that this system would actually defer to his individual preferences, which are really just rank cronyism.
Mhm.
Uh, I think we'd be worse off for that. Um,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh,
All right, moving to Alabama.
oh God. Okay. All right. Another state. Let's go.
Yeah. Let's move to Alabama. Let's do Alabama. And let's talk about the fact that in the wake of the IVF decision that we discussed last time,
Mhm. Yes.
there's been a little panic in the Alabama legislature. They took steps to pass a bill
Oh,
saying
yes.
we don't hate IVF, we love IVF.
Mhm.
Um,
Well, I will say that
what are
after our
this
discussion the other
the
day,
legal
there was.
implications? Yeah, what are the legal implications? Also, what are the nationally we've seen? I think Nancy
Mhm.
Mace put forward a bill. It very bravely calls for a bill
Mhm.
that will protect IVF. It doesn't actually protect IVF. It says there should be a bill
Mhm.
that protects IVF. True Nancy Mace heroism there. But Alabama does seem panicked. I mean, I don't think there's a chance that Republicans in Alabama are going to lose a legislative majority, but I do think it shows that they recognize some of them genuinely just don't want to stop IVF treatment, and I think the rest of them realized this is a nightmare political issue. No normal American looks at that and says uh, that that's a rational political party. So I think let's talk a little about the implications, legal and political, of this Alabama uh,
Mhm.
bill.
Absolutely. So of course, when we talked the other day, it was, or last week, it was that only one clinic had closed. The subsequent was that actually three clinics had ended up closing in those circumstances, right? That shutting their doors to moving anything forward with IVF. We saw the Senator Tuberville come out and make a pretty ignorant statement. um,
Tommy Tuberville's statement was the statement of a man who
had
woke up
no idea what the hell was going
the
on.
morning he was asked. I think he simultaneously said that he opposed the ruling, he supported the ruling, and then he said he hadn't read the bill, which there wasn't a bill.
There wasn't a bill.
It was
But we need more children. That was
right.
that was the ultimate founding of that video.
Yeah.
Yeah, it was. I had a lot of reactions to that video. In fact, I've watched it a couple of times, and my reaction really hasn't changed since that has happened. But of course, like you said, the Alabama legislator is scrambled, both sides, both their House as well as the Senate, right, passing bills yesterday, protecting this right to IVF and protecting the process of IVF. They're saying that that bill is going to go forward, right, to go onto Governor Ivey's desk next week or as early as next week. There were, of course, some attempts to pass amendments that were cleared off, right, just to be able to. But it was an absolute panic, right, that happened as a result of this. Right, when people realized it, and again, like I said, the media flubs of what was happening from the very representatives from those states didn't help the
Here's my
circumstances.
question. Is this the last time we're going to see a state court do this though? I mean, there are other state Supreme Courts that could potentially, I mean, I don't know what's making its way, what cases are making their way through the pipeline, but like, I mean, there are other state Supreme Courts that could very well make a similar decision.
Absolutely. And honestly, there's nothing stopping them. That's the best and worst part of studying state courts, is that the line gets drawn in a place that if there is no federal law, then there is nothing stopping the states from doing what they're doing. Granted, was this a really broad statement? Was this a big flashing neon sign? Absolutely, right.
Right.
Between what was the content of the decision, right, that it was based in biblical quotes and right justification for God and fury and all of these different things. I mean, I want to say no. I want to be the hopeful person and say that they would learn from this, but we know that's not the case.
Mhm.
We know that it's not just the state courts that aren't learning. It's state legislatures, it's all of these things, right? It's all of those entities. I think it's just a new and fascinating frontier, right, to test these boundaries. Again, like I
Yeah,
said
and
last
it's
week,
not as if
not
this
surprising.
IVF position is non-existent. It's fringe. It's absolutely fringe, but it exists. I mean, there's,
Mhm.
interviews. There are activist groups on the Christian right who make this case. Obviously, there's a particular strain of right-wing Catholic political activism that certainly sees things this way. And there are interviews there, the kind of man on the street interviews that were happening at CPAC last weekend. There were plenty of people happy to say this is the right decision. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to turn into any new policy, but it means that it's fringe, but it's not non-existent. It's not there.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's definitely not it's not there. And again, I think this is just one of the first ones. Like I think this is just one of the first testing grounds. I mean, we talked some about some of the other right exceptions that we can see coming through. Right, what impact is this going to have on surrogacy? What impact is this going to have on right other bodily autonomy issues? Right,
Right.
to the extent of other parts and pieces of right the right to abortion, right, the right to choose. We've seen other states trying with sanctuary cities, but also right prosecution and criminal prosecution for crossing state lines. You're seeing more states doing that. So it may not be another IVF case, but it's going to be something. And it's going to be something that is going to be very well crafted in a way that the state is going to try it, or the state Supreme Court is going to try a case that has to deal with it. And it's going to set a precedent right somewhere, somehow.
When you
That's
mentioned
going to ripple
states,
across.
going after people for all sorts of things happening, abortion or other kinds of care going out of state, we're gonna
Abortion's
have to
happening.
dedicate it in. We're gonna have to do an episode, I think, at some point dedicated to Ken Paxton. Today is not that day, but it's gonna have to happen, I think. Um,
We can definitely do that.
we've talked about Republican panic. Let's
Mhm.
talk about Democratic panic in a different context. Before we were getting going, you mentioned wanting to talk. You wanted to to ask me about Michigan. So go ahead. I'm turning the chair to you, and I'll try to tell you what I think.
Well, this is definitely a certain point of conversation, right? And again, in the national perspective, we had primaries this week. Shocking no one, of course, right? Both Biden and Trump sweeping their primaries.
Mhm.
But what about that little group, right? What about those undecided individuals, right? That everyone's been talking about, at least into a certain circumstance, right? Within the Democratic primary, in particular, right, making the very clear statement that they were undecided in this nature because of what's happening in Gaza and Israel.
Yeah. And look, Michigan has the most significant Arab American community in the country. The only Palestinian American rep in the House, Rashida Tlaib,
Mm-hmm.
is from Michigan, and she was supportive of this movement.
Mm-hmm.
One thing about these results is that you could really look at them. There's a way to talk about them in a way that sounds really good for this vote, in a way that I think spins it more positive for Biden, which is if you talk about raw numbers, 100,000 is big. 100,000 people. It's not nothing. You can't shrug this off. On
Especially in
the
a
other
swing state.
hand, if you talk about it in terms of percentage of the vote, it's only about 2 points more uncommitted than were registered in 2012 when Barack Obama was running for re-election, and Barack Obama didn't have any trouble winning.
Mm-hmm.
So, um, those things are both true, and depending on what you emphasize, you get, I think, a very scary situation for Joe Biden, and you get a less scary one.
Mm-hmm.
The thing I actually think that matters is these are not people saying that they won't vote for Joe Biden in November. Some of them won't, but they're not all saying that.
Mm-hmm.
And um, it's just, I think, irresponsible for people to suggest that this vote means 100,000 Americans in Michigan are going to stay home
Mm-hmm.
in November, because that's not what it means. It is in a democracy. There's only so many ways you can express your preference, and the primary system exists for preference expression. The primary system exists entirely for that.
Entirely.
Now, it must be tough on Dean Phillips that when there is a person out there saying, if you want to signal that you want someone other than Biden, vote for me, he came in behind both uncommitted and, at the time, the suspended campaign of Marianne Williamson, who is unsuspended
Just because of this.
after coming. Hey, look, she came in third when she wasn't even running, so she must have seen something there. Uh,
I'm
Yeah.
gonna
So
pause myself from making the joke, but go ahead.
right. Uh there so this is a way to register displeasure.
Mhm,
Um People were, the 2020 primaries were quite divisive. And you had a lot of people saying, "I'm not gonna go." You had a number of people who were Bernie or Warren. I mean, less so some of the others, but a number of people who were favored more progressive candidates who said pretty harsh things about Joe Biden from day one.
mhm.
And they got harsher. I mean, and even the kind of way in which he and Kamala Harris went at it at the debates. And yet the coalition came together. Now, you could talk about whether or not there's fatigue this time around. Jonathan Chait has a great piece that came out last
Mhm,
month about the idea that there's fatigue in the anti-Trump coalition.
mhm,
But when it comes to these like internecine party fights, I don't think it's healthy to look at them as uh, an indication that there's nothing that can be done. Now, our job at Pulaski is not to shill for the Democrats. We're
no.
nonpartisan nonprofit. So at the end of the day, um, it's not my job to tell Democratic Party leaders that they shouldn't worry. They probably should worry. Michigan is a swing state. There's no way this election doesn't come down to Michigan, Georgia, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Arizona. Unfortunately, probably this time around also Nevada. Uh, there's no way it doesn't. Um, how many of those are truly like kind of hair's breadth differences or not? I don't know. But Michigan's one of them. Granted, I think Michigan was an easier win, not easier, but they cleared Michigan more healthily
Yeah,
in
yeah.
2020 than they did Arizona or Georgia or even Wisconsin.
Mhm,
So if we're talking about the states where they really don't have a margin, they have a little bit of a margin in Michigan. Uh,
mhm,
we'll have to see if the administration decides to take this seriously. But I think the people arguing that you should take it seriously are correct. Now, the people arguing that this is a catastrophic situation and all these people stay home and that's the only option is for Biden to completely give the kind of people behind the uncommitted movement everything they want. I don't know that there's a clear-cut case politically
mhm,
for that if you look at the numbers. And I think, there's plenty of people making the argument. I think a risky argument that maybe they should ignore them entirely. I don't think that they should ignore them entirely. I don't think that this is an election cycle where if you're on the Biden side, you can really afford to anger. And that's really the problem is how do you give this group some of what they want? How does Biden find a way to give them clear signals that the United States position on Gaza is moving in a direction they would like without upsetting other core parts of his base, right? There are some pretty centrist or and even conservative Democrats. Not we're not talking just about the never Trump Republicans who he wants to keep mobilized. There's some Democrats that are pretty conservative on Israel and are not going to see too much budging.
mhm.
Um, Probably the big difference is that they don't live as much in Michigan, and so
That's,
you probably can
I mean,
afford
that
it.
is, that's
Yeah.
part of the electoral game of
Um,
all of this.
and really, a lot of them live in Florida. And Florida is probably not in play. And so, this is that's part of where we're in a weird new dynamic where Florida is not really a swing state, and so what Florida voters may not matter as much may not matter as much to Democrats. I mean, the effect of Trump winning Florida twice and then DeSantis romping there is that it makes the case for Democrats catering the way they have in the past to some of the idiosyncrasies of Florida politics less sensible in a turn in an election where you have limited resources and you have key states that are going to mean everything.
No, and I would definitely concur with that. I think that, and again, electoral hot take. I don't think Florida's been quite as important as it's been whatever. what we teach in our classrooms versus, looking at the actual trends is a question.
Mm,
But you can't mention it, or you can't not mention it, right, as an importance. But I don't think we've had that kind of level of an issue.
yeah.
Yeah, no, I think to the point of everything that you're saying, there are some drastic sides of it. I don't think that there is a way, like you said, that they can give in to, everything that they're asking for from these uncommitted voters. But at the same time, like, you really can't ignore them because, like you said, right, a primary is all about choice. It's all about preference in all of these circumstances. And if you're seeing that high of a response in a primary is already having the turnout they have. Granted, they're dedicated voters that turn out to primaries. They're the ones that have the strongest opinions, all of that thing. I mean, it's can be pretty telling. But again, I do believe to some extent that, like, some of what's happening here has been overblown, at least within the media circumstance, right? The hype behind this. I think it's an
Well,
important
the
statement.
yeah, the clearest example of this is that Biden cleared 80% and Donald Trump didn't
Yeah.
clear 70%. And the
Mhm.
media headlines were essentially right, like Biden struggles in Michigan and Donald Trump romps, right? Donald Trump crushes Nikki Haley.
Mhm.
And so it's just there's your difference right there.
Yeah. I mean, and again, I think that's part of it. And that was one of the reasons that I was more interested in, turning the tables a little bit today, getting it
Yeah.
off of the law talk, is because it was one of those things that it wasn't, strong opinions, nevertheless, and all of it, talking about the process of it. It's more about how it's being portrayed. And I think that's an important part of what we do here at Pulaski, is, right, trying to delve below, right, what we're seeing on the surface value of it.
And
So
Michigan's one of those states we think a lot about. Obviously, shout out to our handful of fellows who are either current or former Michigan residents, Hannah, Matt, Dominic. So we have a strong Michigan roster at
mhm.
Pulaski, and we should. But it matters. It's a swing state. That community. Uh, Look, they're not upset for nothing. Many of them have relatives who are dead
Mhm.
uh, in Gaza. So, it's also, I think, important, even if you disagree with the decision, to not misapprehend these people as uh, college 20 something activists. They are
Mhm.
people with skin in the game.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that ever more important, right? Talking about these things is why we do this, is because everyone needs to have the skin in the game, whatever, right, we're talking about in those circumstances. And so I think it's important.
Yeah. All right. Next week you will have an episode with me and Dr. Alex Middlewood from Wichita State in Kansas, and then a week after that, Bailey and I will be back doing another one of these. Thanks everyone, and join us next time.